Margaret Atwood is back in the news again, and she's loving it. It doesn't happen that much for her these days. Hey, what did you think of Margaret Atwood's last novel called Mad Adam? What, you never heard of it? Don't worry, you're not alone. So what about her next big hit, due out next month, called The Heart Goes Last? What, you never heard of that either? Well, maybe that one will be a big hit. I mean, can anyone tell me what Margaret Atwood is famous for other than being famous? I truly think she spends her dotage on Twitter. Dozens and dozens of tweets every day, 90% of them hardcore left-wing politics, sometimes even conspiracy theories. It's sort of embarrassing. Even more embarrassing is that according to the independent website TwitterAudit.com, almost 60% of her Twitter followers are fake. I don't know if it was her or her PR firm, but someone buys hundreds of thousands of fake followers to give her the appearance of popularity. Look, I know what she's supposed to be famous for. She wrote some dreary, gray, can-con novels in the 70s and 80s that were forcibly made famous because every high school student in the country was ordered to buy the book. That was before you could buy fake Twitter followers. But seriously, can you name anything written by her that's memorable? I can, actually. A novel called The Handmaid's Tale. It was a feminist dystopian sci-fi where women were forced to dress in things like a Muslim burqa and men were allowed to be polygamous, like under Sharia law. And it was all under a religious theocracy like Iran is. The whole thing was written as a reaction by Atwood to the Islamic Revolution in Iran, except that Atwood lacked the courage to call it like it was, to make it a story critical of Islam and radicalism's vicious treatment of women. So seriously, I'm not making this up. She changed all the key facts in her novel. So the evildoers are Christian, not Muslim. That would be like writing a passionate novel about the Holocaust, but in your story making the Jews the evil people who were rounding up minorities and sending them to their death. Seriously, that tells you all you need to know about Margaret Atwood. Faced with the great moral calamity that befell women in Iran, this great feminist wouldn't even use the word Ayatollah or radical Islam or Sharia law. She made Christian America the enemy instead of the savior of freedom for the world that they are. What a moral coward she is. Anyways, other than her kooky Twitter emanations, what Atwood is famous for these days is her independent fashion sense and hairstyle. Look, a guy like me should never make fun of what other people look like, but Atwood herself does. And that's the news of the week. A tempest in the Toronto media teapot. See, Margaret Atwood wrote a column in the National Post newspaper making fun of Stephen Harper's hair. Now, Atwood making fun of Stephen Harper's hair is about as legit as saying, I don't know, me telling, I don't know, Thomas Mulcair he could lose a few pounds. I mean, how could she say that with a straight face? Doesn't she look in the mirror? Well, she's got a case of Harper derangement syndrome. She hates the man and loved the chance to poke at him. And for some reason, the National Post, the closest thing we have to a conservative newspaper of record in Canada, thought this would be a delight for their conservative readers. What, did the Star turn down Atwood's article first? Anyways, like I say, Atwood is famous for being famous. And this was one of those moments. But then her article was taken off the National Post's website. Oh, she loved that even more than it appearing on there in the first place. At last, she could be a celebrity again. She immediately cried censorship. Oh yes, if only she would actually write something interesting enough, important enough, that someone would want to censor it. She actually avoids that kind of tough writing. She's not courageous like Salman Rushdie, who actually took on Iran and got a fatwa issued against him by the Ayatollahs. Margaret Atwood, like I say, created a fake Christian American theocracy to bravely rail against. No risk of fatwas or censorship there. If you read her Twitter feed, though, as I punished myself by doing, you'll see she couldn't be more dreary, banal, commonplace. I won't even call her an internet troll. At least trolls are often original and colorful. So if her writing hasn't given her any literary fame recently, being taken down by the National Post website gave her momentary political fame. She instantly rebranded herself as a political victim. Oh, she must have retweeted 50 tweets talking about what such a brave heroine she was, a saint, really, a victim of the right-wing National Post. Except the National Post did put her column back up after just a few hours. So what happened? Was she brutally censored? What did they delete? Is she a hero, like the fake civil liberties group Canadian Journalists for Freedom of Expression say she is? I call them fake because that group has never come out against real censorship in Canada, like human rights commissions. They wouldn't even come out in defense of publishing the Mohammed cartoons. But they actually say that for being taken off the National Post website for a few hours, Margaret Atwood is a hero and a victim and a martyr. So what's going on? What happened? What did the National Post do? Well, there are some obscure websites out there that automatically track changes to major newspapers' online stories. It's like it takes pictures of the stories every time they change it. So you can compare different versions, different edits, which is helpful when they make a little change with no editor's note indicating what change was made. And if you look at the side-by-side comparison of the first Margaret Atwood column with the second one that was put up later, you will see a few changes, small but important. They kept up her weird criticism of Stephen Harper's hair. They kept the snideness, they kept the Harper derangement syndrome, but they took out a few other parts, factual errors. For example, in her first version, Atwood wrote, "Why should the taxpayer foot the bill for the micromanagement of Harper's hair?" But the trouble is that's not true. Taxpayers don't pay for Harper's hairdos. That's a lie. Now, Atwood probably doesn't think it's a lie. She probably thinks it's true, like 90% of the urban myths and other low information crud she retweets on Twitter. Nobody at the National Post fact-checked her column before it went up, so somebody probably saw the column and emailed the National Post and encouraged them to fact-check it after it was up. I mean, Margaret Atwood is a CanCon novelist. She writes fiction. Actual news and research, that's not her thing. So the revised version now reads this way: why should the taxpayer foot the bill, even in part, for the micromanagement of Harper's hair? Of course, that's a word trick. It's actually Conservative Party money that pays for his hairstyling, not government money. But I suppose you could argue that since political parties receive a tax credit in an indirect way, it's public money. I mean, that's a big stretch. By that token, you could say that Justin Trudeau's campaign jet or Thomas Mulcair's lawn signs are paid for in part by government money. I think the National Post probably wanted to take that whole line out, but left in that stretch because Atwood's entire thesis, the whole point of her column, is that Harper is the guy who uses your money for his hair, and that would fall apart if it were subjected to a fact check. Here's another line just completely deleted from the original version. So this went up originally, and when Atwood's column went up the second time, this was just deleted. You'll see why. Quote, "Why is Harper still coyly hiding the $2 million donors to his party leadership race? Don't we have a right to know who put him in there, who he's working for, them or us?" See, that's just what you call a falsehood. Harper is not hiding his donors list. He published it to the entire world on the internet. So the National Post couldn't salvage that one with weasel words like they did to the first change. It was just too factually false, so they just deleted it. Sorry, Margaret, they didn't censor you. They just deleted your factual error. There were some other small changes too, but the two I mentioned were the only important ones. Do you think Margaret Atwood was censored? Do you think taking factual errors out of an article is censorship, or just editing, fact-checking? Now, other media were quick to mock the National Post for taking the column down. The Walrus, for example, quickly put up Atwood's column in a dig at the National Post. But they put up the second corrected version. They weren't going to hang themselves on Atwood's false facts. I note that the Walrus is edited by Jonathan Kay. He used to edit the National Post's editorial pages. He doesn't have Harper derangement syndrome like Atwood does. This was clearly an attempt to get some online clicks for his obscure website. But it's worth noting that Kay was a paid ghostwriter for Justin Trudeau's autobiography, and he kept that conflict of interest a secret from National Post readers while he had his side job. Like Atwood, he is a Trudeau booster. Now, if you're still listening to me, you're either very bored or a member of Canada's navel-gazing media elite, Or maybe you, like me, just laugh at the idea that Margaret Atwood is some sort of political compass that anyone in the country should follow. What I like about this story, this Tempest in a Teapot, is a few things. Number one, it's a reminder of how irrelevant Margaret Atwood is culturally. 30 years ago, she was an official Canadian. Today, with the internet and 1,000 other places to get what we want, we're not forced like school children were to read her crap. This little National Post thing was the most exciting moment she has had in years, certainly more than any of her recent novels. And if she has to buy a bunch of fake Twitter followers to fake clap for her, well, let her have her illusion. Second, this little kerfuffle shows how shallow the idea of censorship and free speech are in Canada. Atwood is actually part of PEN Canada, the free speech group, and I must acknowledge that PEN Canada put out a public press release a few weeks ago coming to my personal aid in the prosecution of me by Alberta's Law Society, and I'm grateful to them. But it's a bit much for Atwood to pretend that having her column taken offline for a few hours while her factual errors are removed is some sort of censorship moment and that she's some sort of victim. How demeaning to real victims of censorship. But again, Atwood hasn't had this much attention since Jimmy Carter was president. My third observation is this shows how deeply self-absorbed cultural leaders in Canada are and how in the tank they are for left-wing causes. Just completely uniform, which I guess leads back to my first point. No one in real Canada cares. For TheRebel.media, I'm Ezra Levant.